Hello everyone, welcome to this week's episode of Living History. Today we're going to be talking about military history, but not in the front line. We're going to step back from the trenches, from where men and women fight in the wars we send them to. We're going to step back and talk about the support personnel and the support infrastructure that exists behind the lines. An army can't fight without the people behind the scenes who make it happen. And there's a fascinating new book called Beyond Combat, which is about Australian military activity away from the battlefields. It's a really interesting approach to the subject of military history. It's an important part of military history. And I was fortunate to speak to Tom Richardson, who works at the Australian War Memorial. And he brought together, in conjunction with Tristan Moss, he brought together a group of historians to explore this in more detail. The logistics, the support, the people behind the scenes who really keep the military running. It was a fascinating account, not just of modern times, but the way this support has been so vital in previous wars and decades past. Tom's got some fantastic insights into this chapter of history that we don't often explore very well, that we don't understand very well, and it's absolutely vital to our understanding of the military and to our understanding of the way wars are fought. So I really enjoyed sitting down with Tom and hearing all about the work that had gone into writing this book and shedding light on the people behind the scenes. So let's hear from Tom Richardson now about his new book, Beyond Combat.
A date which will live in infamy.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Well may we say, God save the Queen, because nothing will save the Governor General.
There's a second plane just crashed into the World Trade Center. I think we have a terrorist attack.
This was their finest hour.
Tom, it's a real pleasure to have you on Living History, and your book Beyond Combat really takes a very new and innovative look at military history in Australia. But before we get into the details of the book, why don't you just take a few minutes to tell us about your career in military history and what's led you to this point?
Sure. I have always, well, not always, since I was pretty young, wanted to be a historian, and I sort of pursued that through university at Monash down in Melbourne, and then came up here to Canberra to do my PhD in 2011. I looked at the history of counterinsurgency in the province of Phuoc Tuy in Vietnam, which is where the Australians were, as I'm sure a lot of your listeners know. Finished that up, ended up working here at UNSW Canberra teaching cadets history, and then spent the last 2 years at the War Memorial working on the official history of Australian operations in East Timor, Afghanistan and Iraq. And I was specifically working on East Timor. And then I've just come back to UNSW Canberra last month. And yeah, it was while I was working with Tristan at the War Memorial that we came up with this idea for what became Beyond Combat.
You're obviously relatively young, and you're part of a new brigade of young historians who are working now in Australia in the military history space. And I think it's fantastic that we've got so many bright young historians working at the War Memorial and ADFA and the other great institutions. Do you think, being younger and relatively new to the military history space, does that give you an interesting new perspective, you and these other young historians? Do you think it's an interesting new way of looking at military history because there's a group of younger people now looking at it?
Yeah, I think so. I think particularly as a military historian, you're always in this slightly odd position where military history traditionally is dominated by guys who have at some point served in the military, and I haven't done that, and a lot of my cohort haven't done that. So I think in some ways not being in the military presents certain advantages, but you also have to be conscious that you don't necessarily know everything about the topic. But equally, I think particularly in Australia, there's a certain degree of generational politics around military history that, particularly for people of my parents' generation or older who grew up during the sort of controversies around Vietnam, that can produce a bit of a negative view of military history. And I think for those of us who are sort of born in the late 80s, early 90s, we're not as encumbered by that. And so we can perhaps look at things with, a degree of different perspective and a fresh perspective, and come at the whole problem from a different angle.
I certainly think you're right. I think a lot of my listeners would probably have raised eyebrows like I just did when you mentioned that your parents grew up in the Vietnam era. Time is certainly moving on, but I certainly agree with you. I think it's wonderful that there is and quite unique to Australia that we have this brigade of young historians who are now responsible for carrying on this legacy of the Anzac history. I think it's a really wonderful thing. So congratulations on your role that you're playing in that. And the latest manifestation of that is obviously this wonderful new book, Beyond Combat. Tell us, as I said at the start of the interview, Beyond Combat it's quite different. It was an unexpected read for me. Just tell us about the book and what you were trying to achieve with it.
Well, so it sort of came from an idea, and I should give full credit to my co-editor Tristan Moss. He's really the conceptual brains behind the project. As I said, we both went and did our undergraduate degrees in Melbourne. He was at the University of Melbourne. I was at Monash, and then we came up here to Canberra to do our PhDs. And we were really intensely conscious of the idea that, particularly in universities, military history is often, if you want to do what you might call operational military history of, the movement of armies and battles and all that kind of gear, which we do, you sort of have to come to Canberra to do it. But the social history of war is done to a huge degree in other universities. Just from my own experience at Monash, Professor Christina Twomey, who is one of the contributors to Beyond Combat, but also my honours supervisor, Professor Alistair Thompson, they would not consider themselves military historians at all, but a lot of their work has been about the sort of memory of service in the First World War, or for Alistair, for Christina, the sort of experience of prisoners of war of the Japanese and of civilian internees of the Japanese. So we were kind of interested by that divide, and we sort of wanted to bridge it. And we also had this idea of being around militaries. As I said, I teach cadets. I'm part of I provide a service to a military organisation essentially. You do get this sense of how militaries, we only write about them, about their sort of war fighting, but actually they're such sprawling bureaucracies, such huge organisations, that they sort of accidentally almost pick up all these other responsibilities that they have to deal with. And that can range from, when we sort of had the idea, we were thinking the management of places like Puckapunyal or Shoalwater Bay, huge areas of what are now essentially pristine bushland or natural habitats. The military has to look after the families of its service members. How does it do that? How does it house them? How does it keep them satisfied? The military has to educate its soldiers. It has to educate its officers. So we were sort of interested in exploring all those roles. So we put out a call for papers for a conference, which we held here in Canberra in the middle of last year, and we got a really fantastic range of responses. And after the conference, we took it to a publisher, as you do, and New South said, "Look, we think this will appeal to a really broad audience of the Australian public," and they've done a fantastic job putting it together, and here we are.
Well, I think you're right in terms of the broad appeal, because I've got the book in front of me at the moment. I'm flicking through the contents page, and it just covers such a broad and interesting range of topics. From, the chapter, the section headings are managing soldiers and their families, military education, caring for the soldiers, and remembrance and the dead. And it doesn't just cover a broad range of topics associated with the military, but lots of eras as well. How did you go on that journey to decide what to include and what not to include in such a broad-ranging book?
Yeah, in some ways it was pretty tough. We had, a lot of people wanted to contribute, and they had a lot of good ideas. Anything that really fit that really broad brief. We wanted to look into aspects of service in the military and the role of the military that just don't get covered by battlefield histories. And as I said, we sort of had some preconceived ideas about that, but some of the submissions we just had never thought of, but we thought were fantastic. We had one guy, Benjamin Hruska from, he himself has an amazing story. He's an American guy. He was teaching at an international school in China when he got in contact with us, and he said, "Look, I'd like to put forward a paper about how do navies remember conflict when it all happens at sea and you can't build a memorial in the middle of the ocean." And so he looked at the various ways that that communities and navies themselves try and commemorate actions, ranging from trying to keep ships at sea to dragging a submarine to Oklahoma and just putting it in a park as a way of memorializing that, to turning ships into dive sites once they've been sunk and so on. So we were really interested in trying to get a broad range of perspectives and stuff that would challenge people and challenge their perceptions of what the military does and what it's all about.
I think it's interesting that you say that, because lots of our listeners would have served in the military themselves or have family or friends who serve in the military. And I think anyone who spends any time around the military learns pretty quickly that it's a world unto itself. It's an entire community. It's a way of life that doesn't relate very well to what happens in other civilian parts of life. And there's so much more to it than just combat. Do you think, on this subject, do you think that when we remember military history, when we talk about the Anzac legend, do you think we overlook this huge, immense structure that goes on behind the scenes when we just focus on combat?
Yeah, I think we do in two ways. I think the first way is there's a tendency for military history, as you've said, just to focus on the combat, focus on the battles, and overlook even the immense effort that is required to get to the battle, if that makes sense. The effort to train, to equip, to prepare over the long term for the trial of combat, and so I think a lot more work could be done in Australia on that. But also, there's a feeling among a few of us of that younger brigade that the huge stretches of time in which the Australian military isn't engaged in combat at all of the things they're doing then and the life of soldiers in that time period needs to be explored more fully, both to sort of tell their stories, but also tell the way in which the military, the Defence Force as an institution, impacts Australian life more broadly, or indeed life overseas. I think one of the really good chapters in the book is contributed by Tristan Moss on the role of the Australian Army in preparing Papua New Guinea for independence. I certainly didn't know about it until Tristan told me about it, but that the Army, while conscription was happening during the Vietnam period, consciously pushed school teachers who'd been conscripted into Papua New Guinea in order to raise literacy and numeracy standards amongst those Papua New Guineans who had enlisted in the Australian Army in the Pacific Islands Regiment, with a view to making sure that there was a population ready to sort of assume the role of governance. And they did that. The Army did that essentially without direction from the civilian government, but sort of just looking, realizing what was going to happen in the next 25, 15 years even, and so making sure that PNG at least took some steps, or the Australian government took some steps to make sure PNG was ready for that huge step of self-governance. And so that's a really good example of how the military is doing something that has nothing to do with combat and yet is incredibly important for not only Australia but for another nation entirely.
I think you're so right. I mean, I think the important point that came out when I was reading this book is that Australia does so much that is beyond combat. In some ways, the points in time when we've actually fired our weapons and participated in battles is actually the smaller part of what we do. We've been extremely good citizens of the world in terms of peacekeeping, in terms of, as you say, those operations we've done around the world. I mean, I think it's something we should be really proud of as Australians. Yeah,
definitely. And again, I think it maybe reshapes the way people think about the military, because I know, and you've probably had similar experiences, you talk to veterans who've been involved in operations like that, and they can be a bit upset that, and I think understandably so, that they don't necessarily get the recognition they deserve, or that there's no public understanding of those sort of important roles. And it's interesting, unfortunately, he wasn't able to make it into the book, but my former colleague David Stevens, who's writing one of the volumes of the official history that I mentioned earlier, he makes the point repeatedly that, particularly for the Navy, those kind of operations outside of war are a really routine, but also really key part of what the Navy does, whether it's, even mapping Australia's coastline, sort of doing economic activity, trying to prevent illegal fishing and so on, showing the flag in our region by doing port calls and stuff, building relationships, engaging in what you might call constabulary work, like looking for drugs and so on, trying to interdict drug smuggling. All that kind of stuff is really routine for the Navy. That's part of why navies exist. But again, it doesn't fall into that silo of combat, so we don't really talk about it. Even though it does represent, to put a sort of crude metric on it, it does represent one really good piece of value for money for the Australian taxpayer, that these ships, even though they're equipped for combat, are doing all these other roles that are really critical.
It's a really great point, and something, it's a point that comes out in just about every chapter of the book. And as I was going through it, the thing that struck me about it is not just this concept that broadly the military often goes through long periods where it's not involved in combat. So, for example, after the Vietnam War, there was years and years where we weren't actively involved in combat. So there's these long periods of time when the Defence Force as a unit is not involved in combat operations, but also even when they are deployed, when there are, when you are in a war zone, there's also very long periods as well where people aren't involved in active combat. And I was enjoying the chapter about the efforts to remove lice from uniforms during the First World War. So it's a constant thing about life in the military. I mean, people in the military always say this, that it's months of tedium followed by hours of terror. But that's just so true. And we tend to focus just on those hours of terror, don't we? And we don't look at everything else that's going on behind the scenes, which makes up 90% of life in the military.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I think you're right that that chapter on medicine or preventative medicine in the First World War, trying to get on top of the problem of lice and so on. I mean, it's even the idea of that's so hard for us to conceive of now as Australians in the 21st century, that, like an outbreak of head lice is enough to shut down a primary school now. And yet for these guys, it's absolutely routine and yet something that still needs to be dealt with. And that just the monotony in between life in the trenches is really fascinating. But also that, I think that gap between the experience of the ordinary soldier and how they're trying to deal with this problem by figuring out new and innovative ways of getting rid of body lice, and the kind of solutions that are being proposed by doctors in the United Kingdom that are perhaps medically sound but not necessarily practical in the conditions that existed in France. I think that gap is really fascinating, and probably something that, certainly those who've served in the Defence Force will appreciate.
I don't want to ask you to play favourites, but it would be great to delve into some of these really specific and interesting chapters. So were there a couple of chapters in the book that really spoke to you as telling a new and interesting story?
Yeah, there were. As you say, it's like picking your favourite child. But I think Shirleene Robinson's chapter on the sort of experience of lesbian women in the military I found really interesting, because I've never really done queer history before as an undergraduate or anything, but the emphasis she put on, obviously it was illegal to be a homosexual in the military up until relatively recently, but these women still joined because the ADF offered them the possibilities of a life that they didn't see in their traditional communities. That they talk about, well, my options leaving high school were to become a mum, which I didn't want to do, or become a school teacher or a nurse. But if I joined the Navy or if I joined the Army, then suddenly, this huge range of possibilities opened up for me that just wouldn't have been possible in civilian life at that time. So I found that perspective really fascinating. As someone who works in professional military education, I should just make a point as well. For those listeners who are still reeling from the fact that I was born in the late 1980s, I now look at lecture theatres full of cadets and sort of count backwards and think, oh yeah, it's 2018. You're a second year, so you're probably 19, 20. Oh wow, you were born in 1999.
It's scary how quickly time is moving on. I was speaking to some people the other day about the Second World War, some young people, and to them it was like you were talking about the Napoleonic Wars. It was just so not connected to their experience of life. But I mean, I suppose that's a good thing. It reflects that we've had a relatively peaceful period in recent decades.
Yeah, that's it. That's absolutely it. Yeah, I remember dropping a Rambo reference in a lecture once and just getting blank faces and thinking, oh, this is a really disorientating moment. But yes, as I was saying, as involved in professional military education, I found William Westerman's chapter on the very earliest Australian efforts to sort of grapple with how should we teach university students about the military, or more accurately, how should we prepare future officers through the university system for combat? And it's still, even though that was 100 years ago at the University of Sydney, and essentially if you were doing a law degree or something similar, you could take a few extra units of military studies. It's still a problem we're grappling with 100 years later. What's the best way to deploy traditional university curriculums to help future officers and midshipmen prepare for their careers, and what's the balance between an education that is really applied to what they're going to be doing in the future and trying to give them a broader understanding of the world they'll be operating in. So I think probably those two, along with Tristan's chapter that I mentioned earlier, were my favourite. Although I love them all.
Even the ones that you would consider more mundane were just fascinating when I read them. Like the one I really enjoyed was From Bully Beef to Creme Caramel, Feeding the Troops by Alison Wishart. Even that one was fascinating. And I know that historians these days, in their efforts to paint a fuller picture, I know that Rhys Crawley, for example, the historian, his catchline was always making logistics sexy again. And so I think it is worth exploring those topics that may be more mundane. Firstly, because it gives us a better understanding of how the military operates and how these wars were fought. But also it does paint a fuller picture. These days in the military, most people are involved in support roles. The people in combat are actually the smaller number of people than the huge machine required to support them. So even the topics that could be considered a little less sexy, I found absolutely fascinating. Yeah,
I think you're absolutely right. That. And again, that's the sort of problem you grapple with as a military historian. There's the sort of the guts and the glory is maybe what people want to publish and so on. But how do they get there? That is the absolute key. The old cliche that amateurs study tactics and professionals study logistics has to apply to the historical profession as well. And I think there is something a bit fascinating about the contrast, as you say there, between Gallipoli, where nutrition is pretty basic, but also the whole idea of nutrition, the whole idea that, you need a balanced diet and you get vitamins and so on from the food you eat and energy from the food you eat. That idea as a science is still very much in its infancy. And then you fast forward to today, where there's a recognition that food has a morale there's a morale factor, a morale impact involved. So you want to try and provide the best food you can for soldiers while they're deployed to places like Afghanistan in an effort to keep morale up. But also a recognition that almost like elite athletes, you're trying to tailor a diet that gives men and women the energy they need to stay extremely fit to do the extremely demanding jobs they're doing while they're on deployment. So, yeah, it is. As you say, even things that are notionally mundane, I think the book shows can actually be really fascinating.
And it was those chapters for me as well that pointed out a really important aspect of military history, which is something I try to push all the time, is that if you go back to Gallipoli or the First World War, only 100 years ago, and it's not that long ago, but when you think about they were surviving on a diet of bully beef, infested with lice, disease, it was really terrible conditions. And how far we have come to the environment that the professional soldier operates in today. It's really quite extraordinary. And it is those chapters that, as we use the word mundane, the things about food, logistics, support, it's those chapters that really illustrate just how far we've come in a relatively short period of time.
Yeah, exactly. And again, not to keep, hammering it, but there is this element that, you look at Gallipoli and you try and explain why the campaign went the way it did. and it's kind of easy to say, oh, they all had dysentery, but then when you actually think about that, how crippling that would be, just day to day, and then you're trying to fight a war on top of that. And so, yeah, I think it is really important that we draw out those differences and make clear just how much things have changed for the modern soldier. Largely for the better, but obviously still that intense danger that is just central to combat is still there.
Tom, was there anything that didn't make it into the book because it was too controversial or because it painted the military in a bad light? Was there anything that you decided just didn't belong in the book?
No, we sadly we lost a few chapters, not because they were controversial, but just the tragic logistics of people trying to meet deadlines and so on. But no, there wasn't anything. Generally speaking, I think the environment around the Defence Force is pretty open, and I think one of the things that really stood out to me working on the Official History Project, as I said, is that within Defence there's a real culture of lessons learned, an idea that you have to face up to hard lessons because it's people's lives at risk, and if you lose guys because you haven't been prepared to sort of take your medicine and understand from your past mistakes, then that would be totally unacceptable. And that's not to say Defence is some perfect organisational culture or anything like that, but I think it does mean that there's, even compared to other parts of the public service, there's maybe a bit more of a willingness to confront controversial topics. And yeah, so to go back to Shirleene's chapter, telling the story of how lesbian women, tried to survive essentially within a Defence Force that could be very hostile towards them at times, is controversial. But we didn't shy away from that, and I think she's done a fantastic job in telling that story. And the reality is today attitudes have changed, and so that story needs to be told.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And given your unique perspective on a lot of these topics through your studies and through writing the book and the teachings that you do, what do you think the future holds for the Australian soldier? This balance between having to be part statesperson, combat, experience at combat, obviously, but also building hearts and minds and representing the country and the politics overseas, and this incredible melange of different requirements that the modern soldier has. What's the future hold for the modern soldier in that regard?
Well, I think it's just going to be an intensification of those themes that even as you see more automation on the battlefield, and again, I'm sure a lot of your listeners have sort of seen the articles about obviously the rise of drones, but even the rise of AI and so on as being as having a huge impact, being seminal developments in the history of warfare. You are still going to require a soldier whose judgment is incredibly finely tuned to when to use lethal force, how to interact with a civilian populace, and just make those, and have a broad range of skills, I guess, that can take him through everything from the high intensity warfare that we saw in the Middle East, and even are seeing in the Middle East for the last sort of nearly 20 years, through to peacekeeping efforts or non-combat efforts, as we've sort of outlined, and the sort of grey zone that something like East Timor represented in between. They're just going to have to be able to do all that stuff, and it's going to be incredibly difficult. But I think the sort of good news is that clearly the ADF recognises the difficulty of that and is building the structures, the training structures, and the professional education schemes and so on to try and equip soldiers and airmen and sailors with the skills necessary to sort of survive in that environment.
It's been a steep learning curve in lots of ways. I mean, we saw with the recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, a whole different type of warfare that was required, and that the soldiers and the service people need a lot more strings to their bow than we would have seen in previous wars. Do you think the Defence Force is doing enough? Do you think they're on top of this concept that future wars are going to be very different and have a very different requirement of the people that fight in them? Is the Defence Force on top of it and doing enough, do you think, for service people?
I think so. I think I mean, as a historian, sort of my cop-out answer is the only way we'll know that is in 20, 30 years, but when I can write a book about it. But I think that there are people, there are a lot of officers and men and women within the Defence Force who I think are very active in recognising this changing environment they're in and trying to push solutions. And we've seen, I think if you go on sort of social media, platforms like Twitter and Facebook and so on, you see sort of people taking the initiative and trying to drive discussions about how things are changing, and then looking at ways to sort of implement those changes. And I know even at the highest levels, there is a real effort to make sure that the education and training system is really finely honed and can be responsive. Whether or not training at the lowest levels is catching up with that, I'm not sure. But yeah, generally speaking, I think defence is pretty well positioned for this sort of uncertain future.
Well, it's great. I think we all agree that we hope they are, because the job is getting more and more difficult for service people as time goes on. So let's hope that defence keeps up. But what are you working on now, Tom? What's the next project we're going to see your name on?
Well, I'm actually writing a history of Australia in the Boer War. Again, having sort of talked about beyond combat and the importance of all that, this will actually be more of an operational history, looking at what the Australians did in South Africa between 1899 and 1902, because sort of unusually for one of Australia's wars, a lot has been written on the politics of Australian involvement in South Africa, but not as much has been written about what happened on the actual battlefield and the raising of the military forces that went there and so on. So
it's a really good point, that actually. I mean, it's real. I mean, you're absolutely right. We talk about why we were involved in the South African War, but I think the average person, I mean, myself included, doesn't actually know very much about what we were doing over there. I mean, that's going to be a fantastic project. Yeah,
it is really fascinating. I've sort of been chipping away at it for a few years in my spare time, and now I'm devoting a lot more time to it. And yeah, it is really fascinating. And again, not without its controversies. You know, the British reaction to the Boer resistance was pretty, by our standards today, pretty brutal. And Australians are involved in that. And so sort of grappling with Australian reactions to that will be a big part of the book. And more broadly, how, you know, what they learnt and what they didn't, and how well they did, I guess.
Well, it's a fantastic topic. It's one that I know lots of our listeners are fascinated with. So that is definitely a reason to get you back on the podcast again in the future to talk about that. But in the meantime, the book that's just out now is Beyond Combat. It's available Australia-wide. It's Australian military activity away from the battlefield. And I think it's a fantastic achievement. So congratulations. And Tom, thanks so much for joining us on the show.
Thanks, Matt. As I said, it was an absolute pleasure.